Authenticity. That thing you know someone has when they show you who they are with every word and footfall. They are true to their own personality, spirit, character, and calling. You can watch that person living all the life that is in them. That is what our readings and song, beautiful, beautiful song by the choir today, are about. It might be that they are the carpenter in their family of lawyers or a midwife in the family of doctors. Maybe they found their own religious path, though they came from a non-religious family. Or maybe they dress in a way that expresses their creativity or defiance of authority or love of the unique. Maybe they dress like a girl when society thinks that they aren't. You know those people. Heck, this intern minister wants to be one of those people. The authentic person may have broken their parents, may have broken with the dreams of their family, or even broken their parents' hearts until the family reconciles themselves and sees that their loved one is so much happier with that purple hair, or living in a rustic cabin, or quitting their job to write their novel. Authenticity has something to do with today's sermon. I was raised some variant of Protestant. And back at age 6 or 7, I spent a lot of time worrying about the children in parts of the world where people weren't Christian. Those kids could never live in my mother's heaven. The kids in China, the kids in India, those were the ones that broke my heart. And then I got the profound insight that people were around before Christ. The fact that people were around before the year 1 led me to expand my worry to include all those people who were alive before Jesus' message was delivered. What about them? Was it at all fair that they were all doomed to hell just because they were born at the wrong time? I ultimately decided that God was too loving to give eternal damnation to those who didn't even have a chance to listen to Jesus' message. I wasn't the only one worrying about that part of many people's fate. Universalists, that is to say, the second U in UU, were focused almost exclusively in their early years on who would be saved after death. They concluded that all of us would be saved because of divine love and mercy. Every one of us, that is, every last one of us, would be saved. They believed in universal salvation. Jane Leade worried about human fate after death also. Leade, which is sometimes written with an E and sometimes without, worried about eternal damnation, and ultimately she wrote 19 books about that subject and her other theological concerns. What else was happening in 1681? Yes, 1681 in England when her first book was printed. James II was King of England, and there were 7 more kings and a queen on the British throne before George III, which is probably the British king that a lot of us know as one of the early ones because he has Revolutionary War fame. Indeed, in the 1680s, that was when William Penn was granted the charter to establish Pennsylvania. There weren't even 13 colonies in place. We're talking about a long time ago, friends. What did Jane Leade believe? Well, she became a Christian Universalist, rejecting the doctrine that hath been preached of an endless misery and torment, which hath wrought little effect in frightening or terrifying them from their evil courses. In other words, threats of hell haven't made them good. She had a vision of the Virgin Sophia, the feminine aspect of God. In fact, that's who you've got on the cover of your order of service. Even today, many people can't get their mind around divinity and feminine in the same sentence. Divine feminine, feminine divine, 1600s. Jane Leade wrote about maternity and birth as aspects of the divine. She believed in continuing revelation through apparitions and visions, and she believed that individual religious experience was authentic enough to overwrite what scholars thought the Bible said. That is such a modern idea. This woman was thinking and writing about her fascinating and truly radical theology. Her books were translated into 4 languages. She had followers in many countries. She was financially supported by the kings of Brandenburg in Germany. Yes, those same Brandenburg kings who a few years later commissioned Bach to write the Brandenburg concertos that Shui and Cliff beautifully played for us earlier. She had the same patron family as Bach, but before Bach. Jane Leade's publications influenced Quakers, Moravians, and Huguenots. There are some who worship a female deity even today who study her writings deeply. And most of us have never heard of her. Most ministers have never heard of her. That's an interesting fact. Here's another interesting fact, and this one derailed my whole sermon. She was well educated. You maybe guessed that. She was reportedly married happily to a cousin for 27 years. They had 4 children, and she didn't write one word for publication until he died. Not a word. She didn't write a word until she was 57 and blind. And in the 1680s, that was very, very old to reach 57 in the first place. Most of our month's theme has focused on the prophetic voice. Who are modern day prophets? We'll have heard and we'll hear about that. Who are prophets whose voices we want to hold on to? And yes, what does it take to be a prophet? One thing it takes to be a prophet is an audience. People have to hear your words and wisdom and at least think about them a bit, preferably with an open mind. And now, Zoom. We're in the current day. I will be reading something about listening by Rebecca Solnit. I still don't know why Sally and I bothered to go to that party in the forest slope above Aspen. The people were all older than us and dull in a distinguished way. Old enough that we at 40-ish passed as the occasion's young ladies. The house, a rugged luxury cabin at 9,000 feet. We were preparing to leave when our host said, "No, stay a little longer so I can talk to you." He was an imposing man who'd made lots of money. He kept us waiting while the other guests drifted out into the summer night, and then he sat us down and said to me, "So, I hear you've written a couple of books." I replied, "Several, actually." He said, "In the way that you encourage your 7-year-old to describe flute practice?" And what are they about? They were actually about quite a few different things, and the 6 or 7 out by now covered a range of topics. But I began to speak only about, on that summer day, of my most recent book, Rivers of Shadows. Edward Muybridge and the Technological Wild West, my book about the annihilation of time and space and the industrialization of everyday life. He cut me off soon after I mentioned Muybridge's name and said, "Have you heard about the very important Muybridge book that came out this year?" So caught up was I in my assigned role as ingenue that I was perfectly willing to entertain the possibility that another book on the same subject had come out simultaneously and I had somehow missed it. He was already telling me about the very important book with that smug look I know so well of a man holding forth, eyes fixed on the fuzzy horizon of his own authority. Here, let me say that my life is well sprinkled with lovely men and a long succession of editors who have, since I was young, listened and encouraged and published me. Still, there are these other men. So Mr. Very Important was going on smugly about this book I should have known when Sally interrupted him to say, "That's her book." She tried to interrupt him anyway. But he just continued on his way. She had to say, "That's her book," 3 or 4 times before he finally took it in. And then, as in a 19th century novel, he went ashen. That I was indeed the author of the very important book it turned out he hadn't read, rather had just read about in the New York Times book review, left him stunned and speechless for a moment before he began holding forth again. I like incidents of this sort, says Rebecca Solnit, when forces that are usually so sneaky and hard to point out slither out of the grass and are as obvious as an anaconda that has eaten a cow. That guy couldn't listen to a woman if his life depended on it. Now please travel back in time and place with me from the modern lodge in Aspen to Jane Leade's England. And yes, from here on in, we are beyond the facts and deep into theories. Maybe my theories are wrong-headed, but I wanted to know what happened to open Jane Leade into being her authentic self, her preacher self, her prophetic self. There's an old story that has been told about a rabbi named Zusia. As Rabbi Zusia lay dying, he told his visiting students that he was very afraid. The students were shocked and said, "But Rabbi, you have always told us that God is full of love and kindness." "I am not afraid of God," said Rabbi Zusia. "I know that God will not ask me why I was not Moses or Isaiah. I'm afraid that God will ask me why I wasn't Zusia. I want to know how and when Jane Leade became Jane Leade. I want to know what prevented her from being Jane Leade earlier in her life. She didn't need to be Moses or Isaiah, but she did need to be Jane Leade in all her prophetic wonderfulness. I don't think it's a coincidence that Jane Leade came into her own only after her husband died. There must be some connection between the two events. There could be a variety of interweavings of his death or maybe her blindness, which led her to start writing. Could it be that her loss of sight propelled her visions? She doesn't say so, and I'm guessing that she would if she thought that that was what happened. Could it be that she was impoverished and desperate financially, with children at home and no way to earn a living? Every biography talks about how dire her financial reality was. In desperation, did she create words and visions to pay the bills? Or did her financial desperation break open her relationship with God so that she had new, never thought words in her head coming out of her hand onto the page and ultimately into writing she had to share with the world? Maybe she lacked community before her husband died. Maybe something in her marriage prevented her from joining or forming a community. That seems possible. Or was her husband the same sort of man as the guy in Aspen? The man she cuddled with in bed and shared deep ideas with, and who responded by saying someone else had written the book she wanted to write. That there was no need for her to write it, that maybe it was even embarrassing to him to think of her name, his last name, on a book whose quality, scholarship, radicalism, and prophecy he didn't trust. Maybe he couldn't trust her thoughts because her vision included a female divine. She saw birth, a dirty thing in people's mind at that time, as sacred. Perhaps he just talked over her for 27 years. Of course, we can't know why Jane Leade published only after her husband's death, but we do know that a huge number of opera singers, doctors, lawyers, politicians, brilliant scientists, and prophetic preachers were never allowed to come up because they were women. By and large, since written history, female people weren't allowed to contribute to society in the ways that they could have. They were married women, they were single women, women with children or women without children, all not worth listening to in most people's eyes. Women have been silenced, disempowered, called a witch, and killed for being a she-devil. Being an authentic woman has been hard across the centuries, and being listened to has been a rare thing for women across time. What prophets aren't we hearing today because we are talking over them, or someone is talking over them, or they don't feel empowered enough to even speak? When are we putting ourselves and our visions of truth at the center of the story instead of listening to someone with a different point of view? Maybe a very different point of view. What allows us to listen deeply to the prophetic voice of others? What I am saying is listen to the disempowered. Don't be like that guy in Aspen. Don't be like I think Jane Leade's husband and community probably were. Listen for the wisdom of the unheard. Listen for the prophetic voices of the marginalized, disregarded, and disrespected. Listen. Listen.